Please welcome Charles Michel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So, today we're thinking about the future of pastry. It's been very inspiring to have conversations this morning and yesterday with some of the people involved, and I really feel like there's a movement happening, and Joanna talked about it, right? Like there's really something going on globally, which is something very needed, right? It does feel like we are at a crossroads. If you see on this image there that graciously provided by artificial intelligence, there's like several paths and several ways in which we can head into the future as a civilization, right? There's one way in which the systems that we nourish from are interconnected, where we are in a right relationship with different life forms, where there's diversity, where energy is from the sun, where life thrives. And there's a different equation, which is the standard model in the last, let's say, 100 years, right, since the invention of the steam engine, which is monoculture, which is lack of diversity, and where, yes, there is abundance, but there is also a dark side that we are experiencing today, and which is kind of the topic that brings us together to talk like, hey, we need to talk about this thing within the realm of pastry as well. What's the path forward? And of course, as was also shared earlier, and I feel like it's really important to understand that when we talk about sustainability, it's not just about ecology or the environment. And when we talk about human health, public health, personal health, it's not just about the body and what intakes, right? These two things are intimately connected. And if there is illness or if there is something that is wrong, it's often the causes are multiple, right? They're dendritical, a bit like mycelium. They go deep into our cultural beliefs, into our social systems, into our economic systems, and political systems, right? And decision making. So that's just to say, right, that we have an opportunity to imagine the future as one where desserts or treats are not just a guilty pleasure, right? This idea of guilt, this idea of an emotional weight, right? But rather something that nourishes the body and the planet, and also our emotional bodies. That's the dream, right? It's very simply put, but it would be ideal to head in that direction. So, three different aspects that I will speak in this lecture, which is how we're sourcing, how we're transforming, and the stories that we're telling, right? And these things, they're not in order of importance here. It's like, but they're, let's say, three easy ways of understanding what the role is. So, for example, here you have two images. These two desserts could be exactly the same ingredients, right? Like as in the type of ingredients, not the quantity. But they could tell a completely different story, right? I feel that in this room we tend to go for the image on the right, right? There's something about elegance, about how it's presented. But where the world is today, and the one that would be picked by most humans probably, would be the one on the left. Why? Simply because there's more food, right? So you get more return on your investment, so to speak. We humans and our emotions have evolved for millions of years, right? But the way we exchange with the energy source, with our nutritional source, is very much Paleolithical. And it's very much based in how, in a scarce environment. In a scarce environment, meaning that the fact that there's so much food waste in our industry is because we're always grabbing more than we need just in case. That is a Paleolithical emotion. It's irrational, if you think about it, because you kind of almost always know that there's going to be some food waste, that you will waste, but you're still making those orders, right? and wasting really money, right? That you're putting in the garbage bin. So it's not very efficient, and we are not rational. And this is something very important. This is something that I speak a lot also with big companies when we're thinking of like creating products that fit within the regenerative food system or sustainable or food systems transformation, is that humans are not rational. We are not rational. So if we try to rationalize everything, it might not work. We need to, as I love saying, we need to play chess, not checkers, when it comes to changing things, when it comes to education, when it comes to making people choose option B over option A. The one on the right will probably have less carbon footprint, but it's also just half of the ingredients. If you get with half of the mass of ingredients, the same quantity of pleasure and the same satiety, you're already reducing your carbon footprint by half, in theory, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Goes beyond, and I'm not saying like this could be eggs and sugar and all the things that we consider to be unsustainable. Well, just slashing the portion in half is maybe the most sustainable thing. How is the experience designed around the dessert? That's a very important part. How is the story told, which is part of the experience, of course. So it's not just formulation, it's not just ingredient choice. It is ultimately the experience and the story that we tell that we're going to be exploring. So I want to offer you five different parts to this lecture. The first one is going to be reframing sweetness, and it's something that I believe all of us need to do in one way or another, in different capacities, depending on the context that we're working into, if we're in a restaurant, or if we're creating products for a company, or if we're consulting, or if we're educating, right? So sweetness, why is it that we're hooked, right? First thing I want to say is that sugar is not the enemy, right? Sweetness is condensed energy. It is present in many of our foods, and we evolved, again, for a very long time, to like sweetness because it indicates the presence of energy in foods. It's condensed sunlight, right? That's what plants do. They turn sunlight and air and, well, CO2 and nutrients into a condensed form of energy. And we have a tongue and a body and a nervous system that is designed to hit the dopamine and the pleasure buttons. We get a reward and we come back to this. This is something we cannot fight against. So if just a simple fact of saying sweet bad or sugar equals bad is not correct, right? So we need to reframe that even in our speech and how we talk about these things, right? Sugar is not an enemy. It's a survival mechanism. We evolved to seek sweetness because of survival, right? And most of the things that we do, human behavior is mostly modulated by survival and reproduction factors, right? We're all pretty simple biological, biochemical machines, if you look at it from a very pragmatic standpoint and evolutionary standpoint. Now, the issue is that industrialization, right, since we started extracting sugar from beets, there's a problem. Not the problem, but a problem. Because we were able to make it very cheap. Before, sugar was sacred. Honey was the main source of sugar. Fruits, ripe, not all year long. We're talking about substances that were considered sacred to most of our ancestors for most of our history. And this is only 2 or 3 generations that were able to change that game. Our biology has not adapted to this new reality. We are born craving sugar, and we will always be born, in theory, craving sugar, but we're not meant to swim in it. That's the issue. The issue is the ease of access and how cheap these resources. So this is what I mean by reframing. And this is just one ingredient. We could do this exercise with many ingredients, right? The cow was sacred. It was part of the family for our ancestors, right? 3 generations ago. Even today for some families, right? And now, well, on the flip side, well, we could reframe the saying that, dairy is carbon and methane and bad, right? And we need to reframe and go deeper into this. So what I call the guilty pleasure paradox. When did something that is biologically needed, necessary, become something that is bad? Well, we shift from a rare precious resource, sacred, right? In many ancient scriptures, honey is sacred. Why? Because it was the only pure source of sugar that we had, right? And most pastry was born actually with sugar, with honey, and then was replaced by sugar, right? But again, from sacred to commodity, maybe that's an issue there. There's something cultural and social that we've lost along the way. Of course, the shift in agriculture, genetics, which all favor sweetness. Why? Because sweetness sells, and hence bananas and apples and pretty much any fruit that you have in the supermarket today has been altered genetically. We'll talk about GMOs, bad GMOs. Well, we've been altering apples genetically, modifying humans, right? We've been doing that through grafting since the 18th century. These techniques developed. And maybe the issue there is monoculture, not necessarily, you know, the genetics. In monoculture, I mean efficiency, and I mean, to a certain extent, the greed that comes in the food production systems, right? So apples, bananas, mostly sugar, and the taste, the original taste, much more complex. Slight bitterness, more acidity, less sweetness, different textures, right? We've lost something along the way, simplifying the way for ease of consumption and mass consumption, which favors the economy, but does not favor all the things we're trying to solve for, which is, you know, public health, environmental health. There is a difference between mindful indulgence and overconsumption. Same dessert, different context, and we're talking about something that may tear you up, remind you of your grandmother. And on the other side, same product, different context, you might be making yourself sick because you're eating it every day, right? Again, context. So let's try to understand who we are catering for before blaming the recipe, before blaming this thing itself. When I mentioned the role of conscious mindful eating, here's like a whole rabbit hole that would require a whole lecture in itself. But how much attention you pay to when you eat may affect much more, like, let's say, the general satisfaction, the general pleasure, and how much you end up eating. More so than trying to reformulate a recipe or changing the size. I have a hypothesis, again, this is not theory, but a hypothesis, that the more attention you pay when you're eating something, the more satisfaction you'll have with less quantity. If we had an index, right, imagine this like a measure that would be satisfaction over natural resources needed to produce, right? Satisfaction, or let's say sensory pleasure over natural resources. If you pay attention, if you pay attention when you're eating, if you're mindful, or if you create experiences that are mindful, in essence, you will need less natural resources to come to the same satisfaction, and at the same time, probably reduce the intake because you're satisfied with less. And hence your smaller portion, your 50% reduced sugar, will be even more valued than something that would be double in size. But then it requires the educational part and the experience design, the act of consumption experience design, beyond the formulation itself. We're often very blind or blinded or kind of narrowed into just the formulation, the recipe. There's so much more going on. We'll talk a bit about that again. So historically, pastry, was one of the highest forms of culinary art. Today, it's seen, between the range of, let's say the Instagram, the Cédric Grolet of the world, and the big sculpture of chocolates and the puffy magical things, and Michelin star restaurants, all the way down to the cheap mass-produced sugar bombs that are often incredible. I mean, the most important thing and surprising thing is how cheap this can be, right? And so anywhere in between, right? That's what we call pastry. But ultimately, like, which path do we want to design, and what role each of us? Because if you're here, you have a role to play. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Which is the role that you want to play into shifting? So that is the reframing part. Now, reformulation. Science and innovation. How can we really kind of think differently about this? So first, and this is a big part of my work, is around psychology. I did research in experimental psychology for 4 years with Professor Charles Spence at Oxford University, trying to understand the senses, how our minds perceive the world through the integration of sensory modalities. And so there's just a few quick insights that I'll share here, which this is part of the gastrophysics that I was mentioning, which is a field of research, an umbrella field that would encompass all the different natural sciences, medical sciences, and humanities, let's say, around food, around gastronomy, under the same umbrella of research, which would be gastrophysics, right? This is one of the possible definitions for gastrophysics. But flavor perception is multisensory by nature, which means that if you're thinking about taste, sweetness, acidity, etc., if you think about texture, right, on the tongue, of course, vision is very important. But how about, texture in the hand? Does that matter? It does, very much so. How about the sound that's happening in the room, right? The atmospheric sound. It changes how sweet you can perceive something to be. If there's piano music playing in the background, and this is research, right, and heavily proven, if there's piano music playing in the background, people tend to perceive things as being sweeter. If there is jazz music, or if there's, for example, brass instruments, enhance the perception of bitterness. So you can have the same dessert, change the music, and you'll have a different taste. What does that mean? That you can make a sweet multisensory environment with round shapes, with red colors, with red lighting, warm lighting, sweet piano music, and you can maybe slash half the sugar content and people will not notice the difference. People will be like, this is actually maybe a bit too sweet, right? This is proven by research, right? We eat with all of our senses, not just the obvious ones that we think about when we design. Even more so, like this figure is taken from a research that was done actually with Ferran Adrià, I believe like 15 years ago, this research. The dessert on the left, same recipe on a black plate. On the right, you have a white plate, same dessert, strawberry mousse. And people were asked to rate how flavorful and how sweet they perceive the dessert to be. For some reason, the dessert on the right, on the white plate, was perceived as being significantly, meaning statistically, more sweet than the one on the left. Do we think of the shape or the plate of the shape and the color of the plate having an influence on how our desserts are perceived? Most of the times, no. It's just kind of an aesthetic decision of like, this looks good here, right? The shapes correspond between like my general, but it's mostly a whim or something intuitive. There is a science to this. There's like papers with tons of insights, 15 years old. Sometimes I speak with like some of the most cutting edge people in the world and they're like, wait a minute, like 15 years ago we know this and it's not taught? This is, for me, it should be like first year of bachelor's information. Like, oh wow, this is how flavor works? Right, it's a multisensory construct, so I need to think about every single detail. We did another research where we changed the weight of the cutlery that people were eating with in a banquet. Half of the room had like normal, cheap canteen cutlery, and half had more like banquet heavy, talking about 3 times heavier, both the fork and the knife. People found food to be more delicious, better plated visually, and they were willing to pay 30% more for the food eating with the heavy cutlery. You think that you can try to perfect your recipe and maybe you'll get 5%, 10% more satisfaction, right? Not messing up, like being consistent, all the things that were taught to us by the industrialization of food service since Escoffier. And then just changing the cutlery can affect 30% in value perception. It's huge. Right? So I'm not talking about marginal effects here. I'm talking about like fundamental effects that can happen. So this is the part of gastrophysics and multisensory design where there's a lot of inspiration to draw from. Another thing, and I'm going to reference a friend of mine, Jessie, who's become like a superstar in the past few years with her glucose goddess philosophy and her books. So as Joanna also mentioned, there's an issue with glucose, right, and glucose index, and we realize that a lot of chronic illness depends on how much up and downs we have with our insulin levels and the amount of glucose. Now, it's not just as simple as saying sugar intake. It's much more complex, and this is the nuance that I want you to keep from this, because there's hours we could talk about this, and there's a lot here. I'm just pointing towards something that is interesting to study. Fiber, of course, will play a role. Acidity, fat before sugar, the balance, which, like, structurally, when we design a dessert, sometimes these things are embedded in how we think, but sometimes we forget that we need fiber not just for texture. It's actually for digestion. It's for wellness. It's for how you feel after, right? And this is very important, and this is an insight that we're going to have in the dessert that we're going to have right after this talk. So, for example, 3 examples that can teach us how to better think about this. So, on the first one, some apple cider vinegar before having your brownie, and then you cut the spike in half, just having some acidity before, right? Second one, just a normal pear versus a pear with nut butter, right? Nuts are very rich in fiber and fats. It will change completely. See the difference in the spike? It's huge. Last one, when and at what time you eat dessert. Are you having dessert, after a night of sleep? Not recommendable, or maybe even 5 hours after your last meal, right? You're going to have a huge spike. But if you have it as a dessert, or maybe after just a couple of eggs, right? Some protein, something in your belly, the glucose spike is completely different. So this is what I mean about restructuring not just recipes, but the experience and the moment. We're talking yesterday with Joanna after dinner about how to create different consumption moments for people, for kids, for example, right? But also for adults. What about the thing that you eat with your coffee, right? Does it always have to be bread with sugar and butter, right? As we had for breakfast, which, by the way, they were amazing, those viennoiseries. But does it always have to be that? Plus with sugar, some sugar insert in it, right? We need to think differently, right? And it's maybe even if you have some protein before your coffee, you get less jitters from your coffee. All of these complex interplays are there for us to try to understand better, to try to reformulate, which is the topic that we're experiencing. Now, we also need to rethink sugar in experience design. Now, so we've reframed, we've reformulated, now like rethinking. So rethinking sugar is, I believe, not just about replacing, because often it's like, okay, I'm going to take this out and I'm going to use stevia, right? That was a thing 10 years ago, 15 years ago. By the way, how many of you have had like the actual stevia leaf? It's a herb, right? How many of you have had the stevia powder? Right? Some of you have, okay? It's completely different things, right? The stevia leaf is actually a medicinal from the Andes Mountains. It's incredible. You add 1 leaf to your tea, incredible. If you, of course, extract the active compound of stevia and put it into something, it's going to have that weird somethingness, right? And kind of bitter. So I think that's why it didn't work. Stevia is abundant, it's sustainable, and it benefits Andean communities. Why are we not using more than ingredients? Because we tried, but it didn't work 10 years ago, right? There's so much more there. Anyways, but it's not just about replacing sugar. It's about rethinking the structure, and as I said, not just the structure of the recipe itself, but when and how of a dessert in our lives. Now, the layering of flavors, I think here there's a lot of interesting science as well. So, for example, umami, so monosodium glutamate, which is another kind of thing that we think is bad for us, but not really, right? There's no science proving that MSG is bad for you, but there's a whole anti-MSG kind of, movement for decades. But MSG, in particular, synergistic umami, which is the blend between free glutamate, MSG, and nucleotides, or there's other substance molecules that pair up and create a synergy of umami. Synergistic umami increases sweetness perception. So if you have an umami element, and I'm not telling you to add MSG powders, I'm thinking, if you add an umami ingredient, umami is the fifth taste, and it's the indicator of the presence of proteins in food. So if you add some protein-rich food into your formulation, you need to add less sugar, and you will have the same bliss point of sweetness, right? This has been around for a couple decades in sensory research. Fermented flavors, they not just add, often they come with a taste that's either acidic or umami, depends, sweetness, but the aromas also. And fermentation has a trigeminal component to it. Trigeminal is that nerve in our faces that is stimulated when we have too much wasabi or too much mustard, right? Like that stingy thing. Also when we have like sparkling water, right? It kind of stings. That's a nerve. It's not a taste, it's not touch, it's not smell, it's a different sense that is stimulated. So fermented flavors bring that. It brings complexity. It adds complexity to the creation, right? So it's important to have, and of course, I'm just putting there, like there's also an amazing biological gut benefits from having fermented foods, and you need them, right? And we've lost this part in our diets as humans in the past 100 years because we want to sterilize everything. And bitterness. Bitterness is the indicator of the presence of medicinal properties in food. What I was taught at school and what most sensory scientists are told is like bitterness means poison. Reframe that completely. How about bitterness is medicine? Yes, all medicines are poison, and it's all about the dose, right? But if you look at every bitter ingredient there, you can add some of that, and there's also a really interesting interplay with sweetness that creates a completely different flavor. Example, Japanese, and I'll talk to that. Generally speaking, there's less sugar or no sugar, right? There's a lot of condensed protein. Desserts are very tiny. And often you have like a little mochi, like a proper or like a bean dessert in Japan. You have one, and then you're like, oh, I'm good with food for like 2-3 hours. Why? It's not because there's beans in it and beans are something savory. No, that's a European, let's say, kind of worldview. It's because there's so much nutrition in there that your body tells you, I'm good. I don't need more sweetness. I don't need 2 of these, which is not the case of our European formulated desserts, where it's like 1 macaron, 3 macarons, 10 macarons. I mean, just like, So it's a different thing. It's a different design. This is also rethinking. And of course, there's impacts on intake, as I said. If there's something protein-rich and umami in there, your satiety hits faster, right? You can probably be satisfied with more and basically eat less and more nutritional quality. But it's often a question of nutrition density. So cross-modal design, when I say cross-modal, is this multisensory perception, right? I'm kind of trying to bring it all together. The plate, it's also cross-modal thinking. All these other impacts of the different tastes and how they interact with each other, that's kind of the whole kind of rethinking. Can we reduce sugar while still making it look super indulgent, right? The answer is yes. And that's why that's the invitation for you to innovate within that realm. Soft textures, specific soundscapes may enhance sweetness perception, right? So where is this product going to be consumed? Is it at a loud coffee shop? Then design for that. Is it in a very kind of quiet tea house? Is it in the supermarket that the buying decision is going to be made? Is it for a 4 p.m.? Is it for a late night snack? So really thinking about the actual sensory experience of the consumption is going to inform and improve the possibility for reducing sugar or for making ingredients better. Then the other part I want to mention, right? We need to retell the stories. I want to tell you an anecdote and why I chose this. I understand why I chose this image. We did this research about a decade ago where we served the same cookie to 4 different groups. The people were not aware that there were 4 different groups. They were just given a cookie that had insect flour in it. And we told them this is a new formulation, a new recipe. And we gave them 3 arguments on why they should try this cookie and why they should adopt it in their diets. To a group, we gave them 3 health arguments. Cookies are good for they're rich in zinc and blah, blah, blah. 3 health arguments. To another group, 3 environmental arguments. To another group, 3 social arguments. Other people are eating this and they're loving it, kind of arguments. And a control condition. What was really surprising was that, and at the same note, like that's what we were expecting, but the results were really staggering. When we used the health and the environment arguments, the cookie tasted less sweet, less delicious, and people were less willing to adopt it in their diets. Less sweet. So basically, took out some of the, same amount of sugar, less pleasure, because if you expect something healthy or good for the environment, your subconscious naturally makes an equation that is like, they're taking away something I love. And hence, I'm not going to like it as much. You try it. See, I told you, it's not as nice. The story changed the taste, changed the flavor, changed the impact. So are we going to be like, to create a more, sustainable pastry world and healthier pastry kind of habits for humanity? Are we going to be like, hey, try this healthy thing? No, don't do that, right? And we were actually talking about it earlier with another participant, where she was telling me like, we have a vegan chocolate here, but we're not telling anybody that it's vegan. Great job. It's plant-based? Don't tell it. What way? Just make sure that they enjoy the experience. If you're saying it's plant-based, most likely you're going to reduce the pleasure points if people know it. If people don't know it and you highlight another aspect that is going to tickle wanting, desire, pleasure, then you might win. Because then you'll tell them, oh, by the way, it's plant-based. What? That was amazing. Great job. I want to try it again. Again, we're playing chess, not checkers. So that's what I mean, right? Oh, you want something sustainable. It's the future. It's great for you. Right? Even if people try it, it's not going to work. The problem with healthy desserts is the expectation psychology, right? People assume it will be less delicious. Where do we need to focus on? Storytelling, craftsmanship, origin, and also knowing our customers. What tickles them? If it's color and crunch, then that's the argument, color and crunch. Don't try to sell something healthy to someone who wants something color and crunch. An example, right, of story, same product. If I sell it to you as a luxury chocolate versus a sugar-free diet chocolate, which one do you think they'll like more? Luxury instead of guilt. This is kind of one of the strategies that I kind of want to make us all think about. What if instead of like doing this indulgence for guilt, which is reframed as luxury, and also luxury as in like, luxury needs to be reframed, is being reframed right now. Luxury is maybe harvesting eggs from your hens that you feed with your food waste. That's probably a luxury, more so than eating caviar, right? I'm saying that today, but 20 years ago, it's a different story. In 20 years from now, it's a different story. But what about desserts as luxury? It's a luxury to have access to this cacao from this remote region that was harvested and processed in this way with this ingredient from a local farmer with this hawthorn that is in season. That's luxury. But is it framed as so? Or are you just saying, oh, it's a plant-based dessert? Right? The more we frame things as art, as craftsmanship, the better they will go through, right? So reimagining it also requires having a global lens, and in a way kind of, I was going to say like take out the French from pastry a little bit. I'm French half, and I love what, the traditions there, but why is it always end up being like some kind of French word, and the ganache, and the dacquoise, and the, like why, how about other cultures being involved there? Because ultimately we're human, and there's many humans around the world, and every culture has desserts, right? And they're really amazing, and they often are very different. And if it hits the bliss point to some people in India, or in Japan, or in Kenya, it probably has the potential to hit the bliss point for someone in Ireland, right? So where else can we look for inspiration? And this is an invitation for you to be curious. I already mentioned these desserts. First time I tried it, I hated it. Probably like the first time I tried beer or salmon, right? As a kid. I was like, oh no. When I tried the bean dessert, I was like, oh wow, what is this? Japanese are crazy. And then I went back to it, and that was one of my favorite things. A bitter tea without sweet, without milk, right? A matcha, fine, beautiful bitterness, and then this thing just balances it perfectly. And it's a moment of luxury. It's a moment of pleasure, of also the drink, and it has biological gut benefits. It's been around for 500 years as a tradition, right? The tea ceremony was born around sweets and fine brews. And there's a whole ritual about it, right? Tea ceremony is something that we have in the Northern Isles here, like, as a, tea, but often that high tea is like way too much food, right? And like, but there's something beautiful about that tea, right? So Nordic approach. When I say Japanese, like think Asian, right? Just think outside, like how do we do desserts in Indonesia, right? They have them. It's great. It's delicious. So let's think about what inspiration we have there. Nordic approach, of course, it's a whole trend, and they're onto something. This is, I think, something very, very also resonant here. I also work with the Net and Nile and a master's here, and there's a lot of resonance with seasonality, fermentation, local wild foraging, right? This is a trend that was launched about 20 years ago by the Nordics, which created the whole, Renner recipe trend and all this food that has had a political impact, had an economical change in their countries of origin. Latin American, of course, cacao, where cacao is from, indigenous grains, medicinal plant, natural sweeteners. There's a ton of things there and a ton of communities that would benefit. If we're going to take ingredients from far away, I mean, let's make our euros worth their social power in other parts of the world, right? And also increasingly larger consumer bases are looking for this type of things. All these three things, they're looking to travel and have some kind of learning, some kind of wow that goes beyond just a shiny color and a crunchy texture. They're keen on learning, and I think food can also be an educational kind of medium. How about functional ingredients? Can we make them designed to nourish? So, of course, cacao, there's mood enhancing. There's several alkaloids, just like we have alkaloids in our coffee every morning, right? Caffeine is a very potent one that affects, most humans are high on that one, right? But there's also alkaloids in cacao. Theobromine is what most known, but there's anandamides and there's a bunch of other things, right? So mood enhancing properties. Do you know that the husk of the cacao has more theobromine than the seed? And the husk is about 15-20% of the dry cacao weight. And it goes to waste. I mean, most people in the cacao industry will say, no, it's not wasted. It goes to compost or to cover soils in cacao fields. Sure, it's an amazing tea. It's an amazing nutrition source, and we're throwing it away, right? Right now, cacao ton per price, around 11,000 euros. 20% of that, about 2,000 euros, wasted. Cacao husks. Like, keep that in mind. That's a novel ingredient that's hidden in plain sight. Fermented grains, of course, very interesting things, like just starting the fermentation, activating some mushrooms and bacteria, and having like this little, collaborating with other life forms is very important to have like gut health. Adaptogens, many. And now, rethinking kind of the palette of ingredients, we have problems with butter, and so we say, no, like we need a vegan butter, or we need a plant-based alternative, and often it's become like the unhealthy alternative is actually the one that compensates for the environmentally kind of problematic ingredient, and we're replacing one problem by another, right? Butter is good, right? In small quantities, if it's local, especially in a country like Ireland, just like put forward that you have one of the best butters in the world. Like don't try and go replace it if it's something that works and something that has a value. Now, of course, there's a problem with it, and there's other butters that we can use. But see how I'm trying to bring nuance to these things, because we often think in a very simplistic way, like, oh, cow's bad, and so let's phase them out. Well, yes and no. Chocolate is linked to deforestation. Most of the chocolate that you've had in your life is grown on deforested lands. That's a fact, right? So there's also deforestation-free options, but there's also not wasting that 20% that has been grown on deforested lands that has caused biodiversity loss. Let's at least not waste it to the garbage, right? Let's use the cacao husk. Let's use the cacao fruit juice that is very rich in probiotics, right? There's a different way to approaching sustainability that is also just simply understanding the ingredients that we're using better and reformulating our approach to those. Almond milk, well, great alternative. Do you know almond milk is not vegan? This is something that most people are like, what? What do you mean almond milk is not vegan? Well, there's no animals in it, but many bees need to die, many colonies need to die in order to produce, to pollinate the almond farms, particularly in California, or in the States, where most almonds come from. And pick another nut, and you will find some other social or ecological issue that needs to be addressed, right? But basically, bees are put like thousands of colonies to sacrifice to increase yields, 20 to 30, 40% more production when the flowers are pollinated by bees, but then they put pesticides on the flowers right after they're pollinated to avoid any maximize yield, and then the bees are still pollinating there and they die, right? So almond milk is not vegan, right? It's complex. The food system is complex, and the truths behind it are not simple. Humans, we like simple solutions. So as practitioners, we need to understand the complexities, simplify it, dump it down into crunchy, nice color, nice story, depending on what your customer wants, and then provide with an alternative where you have the power as a maker, as a designer, as a craftsperson to influence the food system and to influence this person's health as well. So I mentioned chocolate. There's alternative chocolate that's kind of emerging, and I think that's going to be huge, especially for the big industry producers, right? Maybe not in the fine craft, but fermented caroube is the ingredient for the win-win. My friend Johnny Drain, Dr. Johnny Drain in London, created this company. At the beginning, he was like, yeah, right. And then cacao price went up higher than Bitcoin, right? And I'm like, oh, shoot, this alternative chocolate is interesting for the Nestle, the Mars of the world, right? For the Mars bars and the cheap chocolates should not use cacao. Cacao should be kept and used well for other uses. So you say, oh, it's fake. Well, it's fake if you call it chocolate, right? But if you call it something else, then maybe it's not fake. It's just fermented caroube paste. It doesn't sound great like that, right? We need a better marketing. But that's what marketing people are for, and marketing teams, right? I mentioned the husk. I mentioned briefly the pulp. But incorporating more of the cacao fruit, I feel, is our responsibility, especially as we are, there's a competition working with this sacred plant from South America, right here, right? Chocolate, cacao. Let's use that husk. I've made husk tea with milk and made pastry cream with that. Smells of chocolate, doesn't have any, right? All the aromatic profile of chocolate is there, and a little bit of the color. You make black tea with cacao husk, incredible aromatic profile, 0 sugar, right? There's a lot there. I mean, there's a responsibility to work with these things. Think about it. 20% of the cacao produced is thrown away, and that's an unused thing. And the pulp, of course, the juice. Tannin-rich ingredients. There's many tannin-rich ingredients. Tannins equals bitterness. We try to avoid it. There's a lot of nutritional properties there, and there's a lot of complexity that can basically bring depth to what we use. Butter, I mean, there's so many things. I'll just say nuts. There's so many nuts, and it's more than what we have right now in the pantry. Every tree has a nut almost, right? There's so much more. And maybe the next billion-euro commodity is hidden in plain sight. And it's the potential for, chefs and pastry chefs to transform this nut or this produce into something beneficial. Most of the forests go untapped, so to speak. There's a lot of wild nuts around. that can be used, right? And those butters are rich in fiber, they're rich, and as Joanna was also saying, calling it for diversity, yes. What's the palette of traditional pastry? 30 ingredients plus fruits, right? 120 ingredients, right? That's what I saw in your book, right? Great, but let those be ingredients that are not just, stabilizers and things. That there's a lot of natural things that can be used there and repurposed in very interesting ways. As I mentioned, the plant-based milks, it's kind of a double-edged sword, even though I feel like, yes, I mean, particular oats is kind of the best of all in terms of water usage and carbon footprint. Oats are amazing, right? So how can we create like oat cheeses and oats, like just go with a very humble ingredient, because it's not a prestige or expensive ingredient. We tend to, there's so many ways of using it. There's a texture, depending on how you use it, there's gonna be like several textures that you can extract from that, not just milk, right? There's so much more. But again, like the grains and nuts, this is what we should have more in our diets. And lastly, food as medicine, right? Rethinking or sugar-coating wellness. There's many things. If you mix curcuma and pepper, they have a synergistic effect, right? Black pepper, very known in Ayurvedic food. All the things that we can learn from traditional Chinese medicine, huge things. Like there's a wealth of human knowledge there that we don't look at because most books haven't been translated, because most stories haven't been told, and because we keep on thinking of like several humanities, and there's the Europeans, and there's the Americans, and there's the Africans, and there's the Asian. Wait a minute, like we're all human here. This is amazing human knowledge that is untapped. I personally feel like I'm completely ignorant about traditional Chinese medicine. I'm just mentioning it like, hey, I would love to learn about this. How about you? What do you know? Do you know people, right? Can we elevate the culture of someone who eventually comes from far away, who has that knowledge here in Ireland? Can we ask them, what ingredient would you use? What desserts did your grandma give you back in Lagos, right? Or back in Budapest, right? Or anywhere else. So that's kind of the approach. There's a lot of functional properties in traditional foods in general. How do we take those and make and sugarcoat wellness in a way? That's an interesting one for kids too, right? Classic chocolate-covered broccoli strategy, right? You can do a lot with that, and it sounds pretty simple and trivial, but it is very powerful. And again, tannin-rich foods. Now, we're kind of afraid with the fakes, and with this, I'm almost done. We're kind of afraid with fake foods, frankenfoods, right? Fake meat and all this. Like the word fake is the opposite of real, duh. But most people want real. The thing is that there's some things that are better for us and the planet, but they're called fake. Now, changing the story, educating might shift completely what we understand as fake, right? Pea protein is an amazing ingredient. In a burger, maybe not the right strategy. Oh, they figured out the hard way, by the way. Beyond Burger received millions in investment a few years ago, and it went down after that. There was a little trend, and it went down. Now the people who have invested millions and millions into these alternative Beyond Meats, they're asking themselves, like, what do we do? We have an amazing technology that could be delicious, made unhealthy because we want to fake beef, right? There's a lot there. Giving you the solein example, how many of you have heard about solein? Protein made from thin air. Nobody. This is funny. I've been known about this company since its beginnings, like 6-7 years ago. Only a few people in the industry know, but this is probably, if you have a food company, you can actually ask for a sample. They're making protein out of thin air, and this is not fake, right? It's solar energy, air equals protein. Go figure. It looks like a very scary machine, but ultimately it is what they call solein. It's a powder. It can replace egg yolks, it can make milks, it can make cookies, and it's amazing in its footprint because it has almost none. It absorbs carbon, right? Is that solution is there. And like that solution, there's so many technologies. Like I've been in labs with millions of dollars in equipment, like the size of like a fourth of this room, and they can create any type of any type of flavor, right? Most people are scared because it's chemistry. Wait a minute, like chemistry, like alchemy, like that's what pastry and chefs have been doing for thousands of years. Of course, I'm not saying that we should put certain ingredients in Michelin-star restaurants and in fine desserts, right? There's a poetry to certain things. But to feed a growing population in a sustainable way within planetary boundaries, we need to see these solutions. And maybe there's solutions there for us as well, right? Protein made from sun sounds much better than fake something, whatever, right? But you could also call it fake protein, and that wouldn't work because it's a different narrative, right? Protein made from sunlight, that's attractive, right? Again, narratives, technology, all of these things enter into thinking differently about innovation. And will this end? It's about the mastery of pleasure, really understanding it, because if it's not pleasurable, it will not work. It's about understanding sustainability, and by that I mean it's understanding ingredients and the food system and being knowledgeable about the ingredients that we work with, asking questions, going the extra mile, figuring out that there's cacao husks that go to waste, that are an incredible resource. And it's understanding health, humans, right? If we get those three, that Trinity, Holy Trinity, then we are creating the future. Thank you very much.